I got something on Instagram this week. I didn't want to open it because I knew then I would get a barrage of other things that said you can make Manjaro, not Munjaro, Manjaro.
Is that for men?
Yeah, it's for you. Only you could have it of the three of us. But it said she was going to give you her secret recipe for free just for the next hour, but you could make Manjaro in your kitchen with just a few simple ingredients, and it was the secret of all the celebrities.
Just
and
like
she had
put a dash of this and a little half a teaspoon of
It was going to save you a lot of money, and you could make it in your kitchen with just these 4 simple ingredients, and she was mixing something up.
Do you have to bake it or anything, or?
I don't know. I don't know. She said she was mixing it, and I did watch it for a minute or so.
I'm going to guess that apple cider vinegar is one of the ingredients.
It did look a little yellow.
Oh my goodness.
Manjaro. Manjaro.
Why pay more?
Why pay more?
This is Fat Science, a podcast dedicated to the science of why we get fat. No diets, no agendas, just science that makes you feel better. This podcast is for informational purposes only and is not intended to replace professional medical advice.
I'm Dr. Emily Cooper. I've been treating patients with metabolic issues for over 25 years. I'm on a mission to raise awareness about metabolic dysfunction and why diets don't work.
Hi, I'm Andrea Taylor. I've been fat, very fat, chubby, morbidly obese, and done almost every diet ever invented. They all worked until they didn't. I've known Dr. Cooper forever, but when I became her patient and we learned metabolism was the real problem, wow, everything changed, and I've never been healthier.
And I'm Mark Wright. It's time for Fat Science.
Wait, does this podcast make me look fat?
Welcome to Fat Science. I'm Mark Wright, along with Andrea Taylor and Dr. Emily Cooper. It's great to see you two.
Hello.
Hi.
All right, on the show this week, we're talking about compounded drugs. And before you turn the channel or turn off this podcast, you're thinking, oh, this is a terribly boring conversation. Compounded drugs are really a hot conversation right now when it comes to especially these GLP-1 drugs. Compounded drugs, they're being made by companies that are not the companies that have the patents on these drugs. They're being sold all over the place. They're being sold at a fraction of the cost of the actual drug. So, gosh, we've got a lot of ground to cover, Dr. Cooper. How is this legal? What do we need to watch out for? Let's start out, though, Dr. Cooper, with just a basic definition of what a compounded drug is.
Well, the compounded drugs are drugs that are made in pharmacies called compounding pharmacies. So those are pharmacies where they put together the same ingredients that are in brand name drugs to give a different alternative to that brand name drug. And normally they are making things that are widely used in our society, but there may be a problem, like a person can't tolerate a dye or something that's in the brand name drug. So they try to make the drug without the dye in this compounding pharmacy. Or it could be that they require a much smaller dose than what's available, even in a quarter of a tablet of a regular brand medication. So they make a much more diluted concentration pill form. So that's a common way that compounding pharmacies are kind of out there manufacturing things that are made technically to be providing the active ingredient, but in a different format that is not available in the brand name arena.
And these drugs are being advertised all over the place. Andrea, give me an example of what you see, especially on social media when it comes to these compounded drugs.
I get hit with so many ads for these. I call them fake GLP-1 drugs all the time. And I mean, I do buy fake stuff. Everyone who knows me knows that I do have a lot of fake pocketbooks. You know, like I'll buy a fake pocketbook. Don't get me wrong.
Is this like from a van, like in an alleyway near your house?
They'll capture me in a van, take me away in the back alley somewhere. So it's not that I'm against, fake designer things, but I am against kind of fake designer drugs. I did get the ad with somebody making them in their kitchen, but they were making Manjaro. And I didn't think that Manjaro would be the same as Munjaro. I think maybe she wasn't that good at that.
You're serious about this? They're claiming that you can make
Make it in your
Manjaro
kitchen.
in
You
your
can make it
kitchen.
in your kitchen. You just have to follow her Instagram. I don't know how much it
Oh
costs
my
because I didn't want to
gosh.
click on it because then God knows what would happen. But I mean, there are billboards for it all over West Hollywood here for like getting, you can get it for like 179, 225. You can get all kinds of GLP-1s.
I mean, this is just a Google search, but semaglutide, only $99 a month. Fill out the
Oh, that's
form.
cheap.
It says it'll take 2 minutes to fill out the form,
Yeah.
and it's
Wow.
$99
Oh my
a month.
gosh.
I mean, this stuff is all over the place. Dr. Cooper, my biggest question is these drugs took millions and millions of dollars to develop, and companies
Years.
have the patents to make these drugs exclusively. Legally, how do these compounding pharmacies get around the law and make them?
Well, it is kind of shaky. It's getting shaky. The law, they were getting around it because one of the criteria for being able to make these is shortages of an essential medication that's really needed. And so because of that loophole, they jumped and swarm in to try to quickly start getting this manufacturing and this marketing going, and taking advantage of that little loophole there, because the main drug companies, which were Novo Nordisk and Lilly mostly, they kind of were flat-footed when they launched their products, and they were caught off guard with the demand, which I can't understand why they were, but they weren't prepared. And I really hold them responsible for this disaster that we're dealing with now, with the compounded pharmacies jumping in immediately and creating this whole market around this. But it is shaky because right now there's no longer, the shortages are going away. And so right now the Mounjaro and Zepbound shortages are over. And so there is no shortage. And so now it's kind of like down to the wire. Are they going to be allowed to continue to make this? Because that loophole does not exist. And so they're trying to work around it because there's another loophole that if it's modified somehow for that particular patient, maybe they could keep doing it. Like that's why you start seeing them putting B12, vitamin B12 in it, because that way they can say
Oh.
it's slightly different. And so it's not infringing on their patent. It's very predatory, I think, this whole thing that's going on with the compounding pharmacies. And, I don't mean to, I'm sure there's good people in there that are trying to help the situation. I'm not trying to knock the whole group, And there are some regulations with compounding pharmacies. I mean, it's not that they are just running wild making medications. They do have to hold some standards. But the concern is that what they're selling, it's not been FDA tested, not the rigorous testing that you would find in the brand name medication, which is why these medications tend to cost so much, because the testing process is so drawn out and so expensive for these drug companies. I'm not pitying them, but I'm just saying there's a reason why these costs are high. And the compounding pharmacies are basically just kind of bypassing that and saying, well, we don't have to be FDA tested. We're going to sell this as if it is the same thing. And we don't have to be FDA tested, so we don't have to stand by the product, really. And so what we're seeing is some patients that are taking these meds are really confused about what dose they're on even. There's even this movement to microdose, it's called.
Oh, people are
So,
microdosing all over the
well,
place.
and
I
so
hear it all the time.
What does that mean, microdosing?
that's another loophole the pharmacies are doing to try to say, well, we're providing it, but we're offering these fractions of doses that is not available in the actual medication. So it's not really benefiting the patient, because the patient's not going to benefit from a dose that's not proven to actually work, but they can still sell it. And the whole microdosing, I think it's a movement. We could talk about that later, but in any case, it's just that it's not regulated. So one of my biggest concerns is that when I have a patient that's on a brand name med, and it's not common, but every once in a while, something concerning happens. I don't want to out you, Andrea, but you had a reaction that was very unusual to a particular medication.
Yeah.
that I had never seen before. And we didn't even know if it really was that medication.
No, we weren't sure.
It was years ago. All I had to do was contact the company of the brand name medication. It was a GLP-1. And I told them what was going on. And they took it so seriously. They came right back and they had me fill out all this information. We fill out these forms. That all ends up being reported to the FDA. That ends up being tracked for years and put into an aftermarket database to see if anyone else is having anything like that. And so it's really taken seriously. Now, if you get your medication from a compounding pharmacy, like I have a couple of patients where they did get it from other providers to compounding pharmacy, who do I contact if they have something weird happening? The pharmacy doesn't have any accountability. I mean, they're not going to take that level of accountability. I have tried to contact the pharmacy, and I actually questioned one case. I felt pretty sure that there had to be something else in that compound because of things that we were seeing in the lab report. And I didn't get any response really back. And so that's one of my primary issues, is that there's no recourse if something does go wrong. There's no one to go to. And I think you could go to the brand name meds, but they didn't produce that. And they have said that the compounding pharmacies are not getting what's in the compounded from them at all. So we don't know where it's coming from.
Wow.
Right.
Yeah.
This is like the classic definition of gray area, because what I think is so ironic is that the FDA has put out warnings about these compounded drugs because they don't undergo pre-market review for safety, effectiveness, or quality. In fact, in December of 2024, just last month or a month or two ago, the FDA issued warning letters to a number of companies selling these unapproved GLP-1s, and their warnings targeting these companies for selling these things for research purposes only, but they're actually trying to get around. So on the one hand, the FDA says it's okay to make and sell compounded drugs, but on the other hand, they're cracking down right now on companies that are doing this. And we should say that a number of the big pharma companies that actually hold the patents have gotten their lawyers together and filed a number of lawsuits to try to shut them down. Where do we stand right now, Dr. Cooper, in terms of, it's kind of like whack-a-mole, isn't it? I mean, these compounding companies are just popping up all over the place, and it seems like it's really going to be hard to shut them down.
You know, it really is. I think it's like, I don't see how they're going to shut it down. Honestly, it's even worse than you think. It's opened the door to just a very slippery slope. It's really, really like the Wild West out there now. And I was shocked actually just last week when I got notification of something. It actually had to do with our podcast. Like somebody had mentioned it somewhere, and I went on this social media just to see what was going on. And I was shocked at what I saw. It scared me. There are people out there, and it's lots of people that are playing with these drugs. And I really don't know where they're getting some of them, because some of what they're taking is actually compounded versions of medications that are still in the pipeline that have not been FDA approved yet, that are, coming out within the next 1 to 3 years if we're lucky, if they prove that they're safe and effective. But people are already jumping on taking those in a compounded form, and they're actually mixing them with other meds. So they're taking compounded semaglutide or tirzepatide, which is Mounjaro and Zepbound, and mixing it with some of these compounded versions of meds that are still in the FDA pipeline, haven't even been FDA approved at all. So I don't even know where they're getting these things, but there's a movement also. It's like, these are peptide medications, and peptides also is a buzzword that a lot of, I call them biohackers, have adopted. Like, they're trying to manipulate their body with these peptides. And so they see these as another way to manipulate their body. And a lot of what they're taking is banned because it's been shown to be dangerous. So it's not just in this GLP realm. I'm not even talking about that realm. But it doesn't bother them. They still are taking it, and they're actually advising other people to take it. And people are following them and doing all of this. And so my whole thing is, I don't really care what people do. I mean, I do, but it doesn't bother me if you want to do something that I'm thinking is not the right thing. But I don't want it to cause harm. I mean, it's one thing if it doesn't work to get to what you think it's going to do for you. You know, if it doesn't actually make you lose weight, it doesn't actually make you stronger, it doesn't actually make you healthier, but that's why you're taking it because you think it is. If it doesn't do any of those things, okay, fine. It's your beliefs are that it will, but it doesn't. That doesn't bother me as much as if it's harming you. You know, if it can harm you or harm other people that you're promoting this and trying to get them to go along with you. So I'm worried about the compounded GLP-1s because I feel like it opened the door to make that all seem so normal and that you would just recreate any medication through this system. I just don't think there's enough safeguards. I don't think that there's enough at all. And there's really only one published study of very short term where they took one of these companies making the compounded semaglutide, I think it was, and with one of the subscription services, and they compared it to real semaglutide, and the real semaglutide definitely performed better. But it didn't, but that's just a small snippet. So there wasn't any necessarily increase in adverse complaints or anything like that. But again, you're not going to see the adverse complaints come through for these compounded ones. And they're going to use that in their argument that it's safe enough. But you can't really file the adverse complaints. Like as a provider, you can't go to a drug company with those complaints if your patients have them. Where should you go? I mean, I have a few patients right now. I don't know where to go. So I just really, hopefully, successfully convince them to stop doing that and to instead use some other scrappier methods to get the brand name medication.
I feel like a lot of the people who are making all these fake GLP-1s, they're like the new meth dealers.
Yeah.
Like either
That's a
that,
flavor of that, definitely.
they're like the new meth guys out in the Palm Desert or whatever. Or they're like, it probably still happens, but I don't go to a gym anymore. But you know how there used to be like all the trainers at the gym who were all buff and whatever, and they were making all these steroid things that would be in their locker, and they'd be like,
Yeah.
well, for only $40 a month, I'll give you these drugs that make you all buff and whatever. I feel like that's what they're selling. I mean, because you can get a lot of these GLP-1s from the guy at the gym who's got... and that's where a lot of the microdosing I hear about comes from, like trainers and some doctors have it, and they're doing the microdosing. It's like the new diet drug. You take this and you won't want to eat, and it's really great. You only have to do it for a couple of weeks, and then you'll fit into that dress for the award show, and don't worry about it. It's really safe. And that's what's happening a lot.
Yeah, it's sad, really.
I'd rather have the fake Gucci bag, but
I think a lot of it goes back to just a real misunderstanding of what metabolic dysfunction's about, and
I don't think they talk about metabolic dysfunction. I think
Yeah.
they just talk about losing weight.
Yeah.
Like I don't think the metabolic dysfunction comes into play at all.
you do wonder what % of those online compounded types of programs are selling to people who don't even have elevated weight. Because I think you just fill out a form and you say your height and weight or something like that. And I've seen some of them where even if you plug in a normal weight, they'll give you a goal weight that's lower than that.
Or do they tell you to fill out at higher weight, maybe even?
I don't know. I'm not
I
going
don't
to
know.
accuse anybody of anything. And as I said, I think that there are some legitimate pharmacies that are compounding pharmacies that are trying to make the highest
Yes.
quality that they can and trying to help people.
There
Absolutely,
are legit. There are legit businesses and
Right.
legit pharmacies who help people with compounding drugs. There definitely are.
There are, but with something like this, I just see it as unnecessary.
Right.
I've never, in my practice, and I have thousands of patients in our practice, and we've never felt the need to prescribe a compounded version of any of these meds. We didn't feel that desperate that we would take a chance like that when, luckily, I think that there have been some options for fiddling around and figuring out what an insurance might cover and also combining coupons with maybe occasionally sample medication to help out for people that are really in trouble. But there are different ways. And as I said, there's actually a GLP-1 now that went generic. So that's an FDA-tested, it's a prescription
Right. For the
medication.
Victoza, right?
Yep, for Victoza.
Right.
And
I used it. It was
it's a
great.
great medicine, yeah.
It's
And you
great.
can, with a GoodRx coupon, the price is lower than most compounded drugs are anyway.
Wow.
And so it's at certain pharmacies, you have to look and see in your area which pharmacy has the best price on it. But it's nice to see that we now have competitive generic production of at least one medicine. And, I think there's also some patient assistance programs that we've used for some patients for medication. So you have to kind of have your provider look into every
Creative
angle.
ways.
Yeah. And it's just, I think it's not really
Be
worth,
safe.
even if you, yeah, exactly. Be safe. Exactly.
Dr. Cooper, I wanted to ask you about the FDA is concerned about salt forms of some of these compounding drugs,
Right.
semaglutide sodium and semaglutide acetate. They're apparently concerned because the salt form, and I'm not a chemist, but the salt form has not been approved by the FDA,
Right.
but it's being sold as if
Absolutely.
it's as effective. Could you address that?
Yeah, some of the compounding pharmacies are selling it in that form, which is a salt type combination with it. And what the drug companies have argued is that that particular form changes the action potentially of the drug and potentially its safety profile, because that has not been FDA tested at all. And so not only is the compounded solution not FDA tested, but now it's in a form that's not been FDA tested either. And this is why playing with your system, there's another concern I have too, is not knowing how these things enter your body, what's called the pharmacokinetics. With the brand name drugs, we can look up the prescribing information, and in that, it tells you all kinds of things you need to know. Pharmacokinetics is how does that medication, after it's delivered, how soon is it that it's entering your system? How long is the effect? What is the profile of how the half-life, how it wears off in your system? With these compounded versions, that's not been done, so we don't really know. And so once you add a salt to it, does that change things? How does that affect it? And so there's so many areas where there could be an issue. The other thing is with these kinds of medications that are mimicking our hormones, one of the concerns that all the drug companies have and they monitor for is, could someone build an immune reaction to that? And that might end up causing their immune system to react against their own actual hormones. So if this is mimicking a GLP-1, for example, would our immune system in some people get activated to start attacking our own GLP-1? And so they have tested all of this so thoroughly in the pharmaceutical industry because it has been a known potential risk. And they've mitigated and they've looked and they've really been observing these immune reactions with these, going way back to the very first GLP-1s that came out and the first amylin analog. They've looked at this. And also there was a leptin mimicker as well, synthetic leptin, and that was another one that they were seeing potential risk of those immune reactions with. But that's another reason why would you do the compounded version? Because that's not been tested in there. And the risk of having an immune reaction work against your own GLP-1 is really not good, because that could cause long-term problems. And so even when you're not even on the compounded version, I'm not trying to scare people, but I'm just trying to say, really think about it. Is it really worth it to take that chance? And as I said, there's not a shortage anymore of the Mounjaro and the Zepbound, and the semaglutide is, I believe, almost out of the shortage. They say there's no shortage anymore of semaglutide, Ozempic, or Wegovy, but I think the FDA, I'm not sure if they've removed it from the shortage list yet, because it has to be a certain number of steady weeks after the shortage is resolved to remove it. But if these are no longer in shortage, what would be the rationale for using a compounded version anyway? It doesn't meet the legal requirements. It is infringing on their patents. Not that I'm trying to protect them, but it really is. And if they put a little B12 in it to get around it, that's a sure sign that they're trying to find a loophole and they're trying to rip you off, because you could just take a B12 supplement. You don't need to have it mixed into your GLP-1. And it costs pennies to take a B12 supplement.
Yeah, that's interesting.
Yeah.
Just going to the FDA website, they have a lot of information about just how dangerous all of these things are that you've talked about, Dr. Cooper, in terms of dosing problems, adverse events. There are a lot of reasons not to do this. And my question, I'm guessing, Dr. Cooper, is that I'm curious, we can't just go buy Ozempic without a prescription. So how is it that you can get these drugs without a prescription? I just don't understand how that's even possible.
Well, you really can't. And so someone's prescribing it if you're getting it. And so if it's the online, they hook up with some doctor they put in that position that will approve these prescriptions.
Like in Barbados or somewhere?
Well, they would be licensed in the state where you are, and they'd be approving these prescriptions. A doctor or nurse practitioner, physician assistant, someone with a license will be, and they also might mean well. They may not really be aware of all this potential risk, or they may not, they're just hired to do this. Not that they shouldn't have responsibility, but that's how they're getting it. Or it could be your own provider that you've known for a long time that has told you, hey, why don't you get this compounded version? It's less expensive. And maybe, again, they don't have the same perspective I do about it. And so, again, I know that my perspective is not the same as a lot of other providers out there that are in the field. A lot of other providers might be comfortable with this. I know some that are not, and I am not comfortable with the compounded versions, and that's my professional opinion about it. But there's always going to be a prescribing person who's writing that prescription. And they may or may not have a relationship with you, because that's how things are structured now with this online pharmacy type solution, which I think it started with erectile dysfunction. It did. It started with erectile dysfunction prescriptions because people were kind of shy about it. And they had the online version, and then it was dermatology. Like, I don't know what was going on with the dermatology field, but they got into it. And now it seems to be, you can definitely, I'm sure that like the whole weight culture, that was just really ripe for it.
It's all focused on weight. It's all
because
focused on weight. Yeah.
It was already all the online structure there for the diets. And all they have now is a diet and a doctor with a prescription.
It's penises, hair loss, and weight.
But yeah, unfortunately. And so I don't know. I think it's education too about, I mean,
leave it to Andrea to just boil it down
hair loss, weight,
to its essence. But you know what I think is just troubling is that if a state licensed medical professional has to sign off on this stuff, and oftentimes they have no relationship with the person getting the drug, that tells me one thing, that they're just concerned about making money. And that's really concerning if that's how this whole thing is shaking out.
It is. It's sad. It's kind of a strange model. But again, a lot of people, they are not, I don't know, they might think and see it differently, because they may see, well, we're giving the same thing and it's lower price. But they're not really, I don't think they're thinking it through clearly enough. So, and I think they also feel the pressure because, especially during the shortages, in order to get your patients treated, you did have to be kind of really out of the box and try to figure out strategies and work a lot harder to try to get them the brand name medications during shortage periods. And even now with the prior authorizations, this is a way it bypasses the prior authorizations because insurance won't cover it, the compounded version. So then the doctors and prescribers are not tied up with having to respond with all this prior authorization to the insurance to fill out those forms. So for them, they might see it as a convenience as well. That, oh, well, I'm just going to bypass that whole insurance problem and just write this prescription for this compounded version, done.
I feel like for many years, you've heard stories of like, oh, well, this has been prescribed in Europe for many years, so how come they aren't doing that in the U.S.? Could you address that, Dr. Cooper? There's a very rigid and very intentional design to the drug testing and approval system in the United States. And some people, I think, sort of mock that for being too restrictive and too careful. It's like, oh, this has been available in Canada for this use, so how come they don't do it here? Could you address that? Because this is a very well thought out system.
Yes. Well, it's tough. I mean, getting drugs approved, especially in the quote obesity category, anything for weight, is extremely difficult in the US. And that started because the FDA decided many years ago, I think it was more than a decade ago, that the manufacturers of weight related treatments had to go through more rigorous additional testing for cardiovascular risk. And the reason for that was because of the fen-phen problem. Back in, wasn't it in the 90s, I think? Maybe the early 2000s. Fen-phen was found to cause significant cardiovascular risk. But at the time it was released, that wasn't disclosed. And so even though there was some information that kind of pointed to that being a concern, so after that and once these other medications started coming out again for the treatment of weight-related issues, quote, obesity, then the FDA came out with regulations that said that those drugs have to do thorough cardiovascular testing as part of their clinical trials. And that made the number of people tested had to go up quite a bit by thousands.
Ooh.
And the duration of testing had to go up for much longer. And the post-drug period of monitoring had to go up too. So that's what caused the expenses to really make them more expensive. And the funny thing is, now that we look back at it, those are still in place. And so they still do the cardiovascular monitoring. But now that we know about them, they're actually cardioprotective. So what we were concerned about, it turned out, actually, they reduce our cardiovascular risk.
Right. It ended up being a good thing.
But that
Right.
took a lot of time and money to figure
Time
out.
and money.
The scientific method, right?
The scientific method. And it's true, though, that our drugs they are FDA approved first in the U.S., though. So it is the U.S. first where they do get their approval. Because I think other countries might be holding back to see what our FDA does because it is so rigorous. And then the European follows the Canadian after. And so it's very rare. I don't know any of these more modern medications that have been approved elsewhere first. It's always U.S. first.
Well, this has been a really interesting conversation. I feel like we should get a closing thought from each of you. Andrea, what's your takeaway from our discussion of compounded drugs?
They're not for me. I am not doing a compounded drug for this. I just think it's too important to really to mess with. And I look at how the compounded drugs are being sold, and I know this is really probably generalizing, but the ads are really cheesy. And they're really like, I don't think that's how I want to get my drugs, from somebody who says you can make it in your kitchen or you can buy it from this beefy guy who's like not wearing a shirt. That's not like where I want my drugs coming from. But like seriously, I do know that there are some people doing the right thing, and there are some pharmacists that are really trying to help people. And especially during the shortages, they were trying to help people get it when they couldn't get it before. So there are some people doing the right thing, but I seriously think that most of the ads that I get on my Instagram, which is probably 3 or 4 a day, they're not doing the right thing. They're in it for the money. And I think, buy purse charms, buy fake bags. Don't do those. Just try and get it through your doctor, your real doctor, not the guy who's wearing the nice shirt. Just don't do that. Don't do that.
Well, I feel like my takeaway is that there's kind of a parallel with the supplement industry and the fact that the FDA doesn't
Yes.
require any
Yes.
evidence that supplements work. And it's a multi-billion-dollar industry because they make all these crazy claims. But I think the difference is a lot of those supplements are harmless if you're taking them and you just are out some money. But I feel like these compounded drugs are somehow lumped into that
They could
same
hurt
category
you.
that, oh, well, it doesn't matter. I mean, it's not coming from a traditional source, but I'm saving a ton of money. But, as you were saying, Dr. Cooper, the health impacts of taking the wrong drugs or the wrong combination or the wrong strength that could be profound. And I just don't think our health is something we should be playing with. I
No.
think we need to be as safe as we can.
Exactly.
So, Dr. Cooper, final word?
Well, I think there's a place for compounded medication, and I'm grateful that we can get compounded medication when we need it. But this is definitely where I draw the line too. I just don't feel that compounding this type of medication is appropriate because of the lack of that FDA oversight and FDA testing, and because of really, as Andrea said, this major marketing blitz behind it, which makes it seem that it's driven just almost totally financially by greed and not really something that we can count on that is beneficial for the patient. So those are my thoughts.
All right. Well, this has been fun. Thanks, you two, for another edition of Fat Science.
No diets, no agendas, just science that makes you feel better.
I'm Mark Wright. Thanks for listening to Fat Science with Dr. Emily Cooper. New episodes drop every Monday. If you've enjoyed the conversation, subscribe, rate, and review this podcast. This production is for informational purposes only and is not intended to replace professional medical advice. Join us next week for another episode dedicated to the science of why we get fat. No diets, no agendas, just science that makes you feel better.